Esther chapter 1. You know, every sport has its stars, especially those ones who have a reputation that far even exceeds their own sport. Think of people like Michael Jordan and Wayne Gretzky and Tiger Woods. Now, we could debate whether or not they're actually the best at their sport or not, but they certainly have that reputation that as soon as you hear the name, you think of their particular activity. Well, in the world of competitive chess, there's no name that's better known than Bobby Fischer. Some chess players would contend that Fischer was the greatest to ever play the game, and he's certainly a fascinating, if not unusual, character. Bobby Fischer was raised by a single mom in New York, and at the age of 6, he was introduced to the game of chess. He would eventually become a grandmaster and a world champion at the game. Now, he had a lot of eccentric behaviors and bizarre views, but above all, he was a chess master. Bobby Fischer famously disappeared for almost a decade, completely unknown. One fellow chess player said that Fischer was perhaps the most mythologically shrouded figure in all of chess. And for all of his character flaws, and there are many, there's no doubting that he was a master of the game. And perhaps nowhere is that more apparent than in a game he played in 1956, a game which was called the Game of the Century. Fischer was 13 years old at the time and was yet unknown in the chess world. I mean, he was up and starting. He was 13 years old. What can we say? Well, he played in that game his competitor, whose name was Donald Byrne. Donald Byrne, at that point, was already a U.S. champion and a leading American chess master. He was also twice Fischer's age. So here, a late 20-something Donald Byrne playing a 13-year-old Bobby Fischer. Well, as the game began, they started the timers, and the pawns began to move forward. The knights went into action, and the game was afoot. It was a game of masters playing. Well, as the game progressed, and if you know anything about the game of chess, Bobby Fischer left his queen open. And at that moment, I imagine that Donald Byrne thought that his young competitor had made a youthful blunder. He had accidentally left his queen exposed to be taken. Byrne quickly took Fischer's queen. But as the turns progressed, it was clear that Bobby Fischer didn't lose his queen, he sacrificed his queen. And after that, he began to leverage his bishops and his rooks and his knights and worked into an almost perfect checkmate on Donald Byrne. That game, the Game of the Century, has been studied and analyzed by chess masters ever since. You see, in the game of chess, you have to be able to think ahead in order to really be good. You've got to be able to anticipate, okay, if I make this move, they're going to make that move. And if they make that move, then I'll be forced to make this move. And then that will force them to make that move. And if you can't think that way, you're probably not going to ever be a chess master. You have to be able to think ahead. Somebody once said that a grandmaster in chess can think up to 15 to 20 moves ahead. I don't know how many moves Fischer could think, but you have to be forward-thinking. You've got to be thinking not just about, well, what about the queen right at this moment? You have to be thinking 10 moves from now, where are we going to be? Well, it's the same thing in life. If we're not able to look 3, 4, 5 moves ahead, sometimes the circumstances of right now can be confusing. What's going on? Why is this happening in my life? It seems to be without purpose. We maybe even wonder to ourselves, God, why are you doing this to me? Why have you brought this into my life? Why is this happening? And maybe it's because we can only see 1 or 2 moves ahead. God, however, can see far more than we can. See, God doesn't just think 10 moves ahead. He already has a plan before the pieces are even set up on the board. God is working out his purpose. He is the grand master, not of chess, but of the universe. So the pieces of your life are moving according to the purpose and plan of God. Now, it may not make sense if you're only thinking 1, 2 moves ahead. But if you're God, there's a purpose behind the moves and the things that are happening in your life. The problem is we have such a microscopically small perspective on our lives. And in that narrow perspective, it may not make sense. Well, in the first chapter of Esther, I want us to think about this truth. God's ways are inscrutable. Now, the word inscrutable, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it as meaning not readily investigated, interpreted, or understood. In other words, it's something that's mysterious, that doesn't make sense at a first glance. But as you begin to understand more, and maybe as more time begins to pass, God's plans and his purposes start to make somewhat more sense. And God's plans are far more far-reaching than we can imagine. We may only be thinking of our own lifetime. God may be working out purposes that are going to cover centuries, not just a narrow window of time. So when we wonder about, God, why did you allow this to happen? Why did this come into my life? We have to understand that God's plans, his ways, are far above ours. As it says in the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are God's thoughts above our own. So what seems like senseless tragedy today may unfold over many years to have wonderful results. Well, as we begin Esther, last Sunday we introduced this book of Esther and talked about the first 9 verses. And we subtitled our study, God's Hidden Hand of Providence. Even though God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, we see his fingerprints all over the book. Now, the first 9 verses of Esther 1 gave us some background on the King Ahasuerus, on the Persian Empire, his kingdom, and so on. And last time we noted that the king was celebrating this 180-day banquet. Now, that banquet, which went on for 6 months, probably aligned with a military planning commission that the king had called. He was planning an invasion of Greece, and so this banquet was probably coincided with that. But it was extremely extravagant and glorious. In fact, look at verse 4 of Esther 1. He showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So this was a display of Persian glory, unrivaled. And by the way, it seems that Persian culture especially relishes this. In 1971, the Shah of Iran had a giant party to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian culture. And the Queen of England was invited. Dignitaries from all over the world were invited to this 4-day banquet in 1971. Lots of big-name politicians, entertainers that you probably know were invited. 600 guests in all. They expect that the Shah of Persia spent upwards of $150 million planning this party. I mean, they had quail's eggs imported from Europe to feed to the guests. Thousands of gallons of wine brought in, the finest champagne in France. 50,000 songbirds from Europe were imported just for this event to sort of give atmosphere. I mean, it was incredibly lavish. Well, that's what the king is doing here. It's this marvelous display of his glory and how great his kingdom is. But then at the end of 180 days of feasting, they have another feast, a 7-day feast. And this was sort of a conclusion. All right, we've been having this continuous banquet in order to facilitate the military planning commission. But now, the planning is done, let's celebrate. Let's all enjoy ourselves for a little bit. That's exactly what they do. Verse 9 and 8 and 9 says that there was this 7-day feast that was planned, and the wine continued to flow. Queen Vashti had her own feast for the women in the royal palace. So it was, in some ways, a segregated feast here. Queen Vashti had the women of the harem, no doubt, in her own party, private party. But as we look at this chapter, and we're going to look at verses 10 to 22, what we're going to witness is a king sacrificing his queen. Not on a chessboard, but in an ego move. But if we look more carefully, at Esther 1, we can also see that the Grand Master, God himself, is moving pieces on the board in order that it may be exactly the way he intends it. So we begin in verse 10 with, number 1, the king's unreasonable demand. The king's unreasonable demand. Look at this with verse 10. On the 7th day, that is the 7th day of the 7-day feast, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So as we descend down here into verse 10, we descend into the scene of drunken debauchery. 7 days of feasting. And the wine has continued to flow unstopped during this whole time. It's just out of control, outrageous. And that's how it is, isn't it? When you have a drunken party, whether it's in college or on a college campus or even in a corporate office. You know, when the alcohol comes out and people begin to do stupid things. And that's exactly what starts to happen here. So for the past 6 months, they've been running this banquet. And now it says here in verse 5, that all the people of the city, small and great, were invited into the courts. So all of Persia, in a sense, has come out for this celebration. And the king plans a sort of final moment, something, the big finale to this party. Now, we do learn a couple of things about Ahasuerus, the king, in this passage. First, we see something about his drunkenness here. Look at verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Now, you don't need to know Hebrew to understand what that phrase means, right? His heart was merry with wine. He was drunk. And that was exactly the purpose of the drinking in this party. It was to get drunk. And here he is. Now, one good thing we can note here is he's a happy drunk, at least for the moment, right? He's merry with wine, rather than being angry or grumpy. But that may change here in the next couple verses. But he's happy, intoxicated. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who gives us a lot of background to Xerxes, who Ahasuerus is his other name, Greek name is Xerxes. Herodotus writes this: it was their general practice, talking about the Persians, to deliberate upon affairs of weight when they are drunk. And then, on the morrow, when they are sober, the decision to which they came the night before is put before them by the master of the house. And if it is approved of, they act on it. If not, they set it aside. Sometimes, however, they are sober at their first deliberation, but in this case, they always reconsider the matter under the influence of wine. So in other words, you can't make a decision in Persia without getting drunk at some point. That was the idea. And thankfully, they had at least, if they made a decision at night when they were all drunk, they would check it in the morning and say, was that a good decision or not? Because we were all a little bit fuzzy on that. Well, all their deliberations seem to happen in the presence of alcohol. Now, I can tell you right now, Esther chapter 1 is not going to have a good conclusion, is it? Because what story that starts with a bunch of men drunk at a party is going to have a good ending? It's not. What we're seeing is sin on display in the Persian court. The Bible categorically and clearly condemns drunkenness. Alcohol blinds the mind and numbs the senses. And people who use it and drink to excess lose their inhibitions. They act differently under the influence of the bottle. Drunkenness is foolish. Here, the Bible's, the most powerful leaders in the world at the time are all drinking like fools and making fools of themselves. Book of Proverbs, in chapter 20, verse 1 says, "Wine is a mocker and strong drink a brawler. Whoever is led astray by it is unwise." And that's what we have here. And we could have testimony even here in our own church of the effects of alcohol and how it's controlled people's lives. And thank God we also have stories here of how God has delivered people from the enslavement of alcohol. But here the king of Persia is drunk, and it causes him to do something completely foolish and irresponsible. That leads us not only to his drunkenness, but also his egotism. I'm not sure that's the right word, but it's the best I could come up with. Because here the king is going to try and, in this drunken state, display how great he is. This is all about King Ahasuerus. He has no thought of how this might be perceived by others or how his wife might feel about this. But his ego gets the best of him. And so what he does is he calls for Vashti to come to the banquet to present herself. Now he sends off some attendants, and they're listed in verse 10, different eunuchs who no doubt were servants of Vashti as well as of the king. And he sends, and he wants to brag on his wife and her beauty. Now the Bible doesn't tell us why he sent for her or why now he sends for her. But if we know anything about human nature, we can probably take a guess, right? When you get a bunch of guys together, oftentimes it turns into bragging. You throw in a couple of beers and it gets even worse. So probably this party started off with, well, who do you think's the strongest around here? And so begin the arm wrestling championship. And then after that, they say, well, who can drink the most beer around here? And they start to do that. And as you can see, it just keeps getting worse and worse. And now the seventh day of the feast, it's probably now come to the topic of their different sexual exploits, which, those kind of degraded topics tend to come up when you've been drinking too much. And so here goes the conversation. One Jewish midrash, which was like a commentary, a Jewish commentary of the text, that would try and fill in some of the missing information. And, it's legend, so take it for what it is. But one Jewish midrash said that the conversation happened like this, where the people were arguing about which were the most beautiful women in the kingdom. Persia was the Medo-Persian Empire. It was a combination of Media and Persia, two different nations that came together. And so the argument was, are Median women more beautiful or Persian women more beautiful? And supposedly, King Ahasuerus at this time steps up and says, well, my wife is neither Persian nor Median. She is Chaldean. She's Babylonian. And she's the most beautiful. Let me show you. And so he sends for her to come. Now, this is something he undoubtedly would never have done if he was sober and in his right mind. But he makes a very unreasonable demand. He calls for her to come. Now, it says in verse 11, to bring Queen Vashti. Her name itself, Vashti, means beautiful or desirable. And so she was probably a woman of unusual beauty. History records that she was also known by the name Amestris. Well, here he calls because of his ego. It doesn't really have to do with her beauty so much as he wants to be patted on the back by all of his buddies and tell him how good he has it. So the request was unreasonable, it was foolish. And he makes this demand inspired more by his ego and his drunkenness by any common sense or decency. So we begin with the king's unreasonable demand. And right there, you already, like I said, we're descended this scene where it's just unrestrained sin. What good is going to come from this story? And that is followed up by the queen's understandable defiance. The queen's understandable defiance. Her refusal is something that we say, yeah, I get that, given the circumstances. But it's also shocking. Because here's the most powerful man in the world, the Persian king. Nobody says no to Xerxes. Nobody. So the fact that she would say, sorry, not coming. I've got to do my hair tonight or whatever the excuse was. But she said, I'm not coming to the most powerful man in the world. Look at verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So she says no. Here's the question. What should we make of Vashti's insubordination here? Is this a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? Well, it might be easy for us to jump to conclusions. But I encourage you to slow down and think about it rather than just cheer for Vashti or condemn her. Her disobedience the Bible doesn't give us an evaluation. It doesn't tell us in an extended way, what she did was right, what she did was wrong. Here's what motivated her. In fact, we know nothing other than the fact that she just straight up refused, which has led to basically two opinions about Vashti. Let me give them to you. Opinion number one is that she was a positive model of virtue. This is the positive view of Vashti. Many interpreters, especially modern interpreters, see Vashti as a noble, upstanding character. Her refusal to obey the king's request is a display of strength and dignity and moral fiber. She stood up for herself against this lustful king. And there's a lot of things in the text that would indicate that this might be the right interpretation, right? First of all, there's this carousing party where everybody's getting drunk, and now the king wants to bring the queen. I mean, the whole thing just smacks of immodesty. It's like, of course she refuses. So even the setting itself seems to support that. Furthermore, some people have looked at verse 11, and in this phrase, it says, Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown. Some people believe that might indicate that she was invited to come wearing only her royal crown and nothing else. So basically, she would be paraded like meat out before a bunch of hungry dogs. And so the whole thing would have been just degrading. And so Vashti refuses. She's dignified. She's upright. She's not going to submit herself to this kind of treatment. Herbert Lockyer, in his book, The Women of the Bible, takes a very positive stance toward Vashti. Here's what he writes. Her self-respect and high character meant more to her than her husband's vast realm. Rather than cater to the vanity and sensuality of drunkards, she courageously sacrificed a kingdom. Rather than lower the white banner of womanly modesty, Vashti accepted disgrace and dismissal. So Vashti is the hero in this story if you take the positive view of her. In fact, she's one of the most honorable people in the whole book of Esther if you take this positive view. But are we to understand and assume that the women of the harem, including Vashti, were particularly upright and modest? One author I read on this, he's a pastor, but he commented and said before he became a pastor, he had worked for a catering company, catering parties. And his comment was, oftentimes I found that parties where it was exclusively women were in no way less outrageous than the parties he served where it was just men. The behavior was just as bad in some ways. So are we to think that the harem, and particularly Vashti, were sort of these chaste, very upright women who had a great dignity about them? Well, this leads us to the second opinion, which is that Vashti is a negative example of insubordination. In this view, Vashti is not heroic, she's an unsubmissive wife. Now, this view was held by a lot of older interpreters and seems to be less popular now in our more egalitarian society. But this view also has some merits to it. Rather than seeing some immodest suggestion with the whole wearing the royal crown, the expression here might mean that she was to appear with the royal crown and all of her royal garments. So she was to come dressed to the hilt in a way. And this seems to fit with verse 4, where it says that the king was showing his riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his majesty. So he wants her to appear in his court, dressed in all of her royal raiment. And Vashti refuses because basically she's too snooty and snobbish to come. Again, another Jewish tradition says that Vashti was the daughter of Balthazar, who was the deposed king of Babylon. You can read about his downfall in Daniel 5. And so she viewed herself as being, the rightful queen, and Xerxes was just the son of a usurper, the son of a king who came along later. She was real royalty. It was in her blood. He was just a conquering king. And so she was too good for him. Now, here's the question. Which of these views is correct? Was Vashti positive? Was she a negative? We don't know exactly. The Bible does not explicitly tell us. Now, you can prefer one or the other view. That's fine. But one interesting thing I found as I read commentaries and read books on this topic, almost everybody would take one of these two opinions and then they would be dogmatic. It has to be, this is the way it was. Where I'm saying it's not entirely clear whether she was positive or negative. Like I said, you may prefer one of the other suggestions. But we'll circle back to whether or not why I think about Vashti a little bit later. But clearly, we can understand either way why she might refuse this king's invitation. Third, we also see that the queen's refusal leads to the advisor's unwise direction. So now the advisors step in. Look at verse 12. Vashti refused to come, and therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So the king is just enraged over this whole thing. He goes from being that happy drunk to now being an angry drunk. One commentator said the king could not control his temper or his thirst. Well, he flies off the handle, which is, by the way, consistent with everything we know about Xerxes as a person. He was just irrational, and he was impulsive. And so he completely flies into a rage. Now the advisors step in. Now the Bible encourages us to listen to wise advice, does it not? Proverbs 12:15 says, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice." But the key is wise advice. The advice these men are going to give is not wise advice, it's self-centered advice. Let's read it together. Verse 12, and I'll read to the end of the chapter. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command brought by the eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew the law and justice. Those closest to him were being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. And when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded the Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be an excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before the king. And let the king give her position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all the empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his house and speak in the language of his own people. So here's the advice. And we first see the reaction in the passage. The reaction of the king. First, he flies into this rage. He's angry. And then he turns to his advisors. The king said to the wise men, verse 13, who understood the times. Now, the wise men are listed for us in verse 14, 7 of them, princes of Persia. These were men of understanding. These were advisors to the king. The king couldn't memorize all the laws of the Medes and Persians and know all. So these are basically his team of lawyers. It's his cabinet, whom he can consult. And if he's got a question about the laws or what to do in a certain situation, these guys will present themselves and give suggestions. Ultimately, the king is the one who makes the decision, but here's the advisors. The Bible says here, these wise men understood the times in verse 13. That's probably a reference to divination. That these were people who practiced astrology, understood the times, and understood the stars, and understood all these religious practices of the Persians. They also knew the law and justice. So the king consults them. Basically says, listen, Vashti's not obeyed. What do I do? I look like an idiot right now. What recourse do we have? What law? What does the law say about this situation? So the reaction is then followed by the response that he gets from these advisors. And Memucan, in particular, becomes the mouthpiece. He's the one who speaks up. And he tells them what he thinks he should do with Vashti. You notice, first of all, he really exaggerates the situation, doesn't he? Not only has she sinned against you, but against the entire kingdom. He kind of puts it in epic proportions here. This is the most heinous crime ever committed against the king. And probably he wants to make sure he gets on the king's good side here. After all, Xerxes is a very temperamental individual. So he says, no, she's in the wrong, not you. She's in the wrong, and she's offended everyone. Can you imagine how this made the king look, by the way? For 180 days, they've been planning a war. They've been planning how he's going to lead an army to go conquer Greece. And then at the end of the 180 days, he can't even command his wife to do anything. It's like, how do you think you're going to lead an army, all right? Like I said, he looks like a total fool before the whole kingdom and says, we got to do something about this. Well, the response then is you need to get rid of Vashti. Write down an edict that'll go out throughout the whole kingdom, basically putting all the wives and all the kingdom in their place, and get rid of Vashti. Notice, though, the reason, not only the response, but the reason that Memucan gives for this advice. Verse 17, for the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so they will despise their husbands in their eyes. So the word is going to get out. There's going to be a revolt of women in the Persian Empire if the news of this escapes. There's going to be pots and pans flying and irons. Then, you notice in verse 18, he says all the women in the whole kingdom are going to hear this and are going to revolt. Then he says in verse 18, this very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to the king's officials that they have heard the behavior of the queen. Now, who are the king's officials? Well, these 7 guys, for one. So it seems to me the reason behind the advice of the king is, this is not going to go well for us at home. We're going to be in the crosshairs. As soon as the word gets to our wives that Vashti doesn't obey Ahasuerus, they're not going to obey us. We're watching our own backs in this thing. So the reason is entirely selfish, as I can see it. They don't really care, honestly, the king's reputation, any of that. They're worried that, this may not go well for us. Some people have even theorized that Memucan was sort of a henpecked husband who was afraid that this was going to be the straw that broke the camel's back. This would be the nail in the coffin, so to speak. Nevertheless, they tell the king, make a law. Make it a law of the Medes and Persians that Vashti can come back no more. Why? Why a law of the Medes and Persians? It can't be altered. And they know how quickly Xerxes can change his mind about things. And, as soon as he sobers up, he may change his mind and say, I want Vashti back. And then the damage is done. So they say, it's got to be a law of the Medes and Persians. We don't want you changing this in the morning whenever you are thinking clearly. And so it pleased the king. So he sends out this edict, which was to go out before the whole land, that all the women, all the wives should submit to their husbands as their master of their house. You can imagine that Memucan probably took that order back home with him and taped it up on the fridge, just as a little reminder there. Well, like I said, as I can see it, there's entirely selfish reasons behind this ruling. And that's what comes out as a ruling. It's a law that's passed throughout the entire empire, throughout the whole kingdom. So this whole thing is a very unusual story, Esther chapter 1. And we might ask ourselves the question again, where is God in all this? I mean, we just dropped into a Persian court, we met a drunken king, a mysterious queen, and a bunch of selfish advisors. Where's the redeeming qualities in this story? What lessons are we supposed to learn from this thing? Well, I know I said earlier that Vashti's attitude and her motivation is not revealed in the text. If we want to do the best we can, all we can do is guess. But let me for a moment assume a negative view of Vashti. Now, you may not agree with that, but just imagine for a second that she was stuck up and selfish and self-centered. Well, we've got a selfish king that all he's thinking about is himself. He wants to display his wife just for his own glory. We have a selfish queen who all she thinks about is herself and how great she is, and certainly wouldn't want any glory going to her husband. And then you have a bunch of selfish advisors. So in this story, everybody is just totally self-absorbed in their thinking. And I guess that's how it is in the world, right? Sin is selfishness. Not to mention, this whole thing seems somewhat inconsequential, doesn't it? I mean, certainly other kings have gotten into fights with their queens, and this sort of thing happened all the time. So why does the Bible take all this time to tell us about this? It just seems weird to be in the Bible. You know, a pagan queen gets in a fight with a pagan queen, and they end up breaking up. Okay, what's the big deal? Well, what we're witnessing here is God's hand in the trite and bitter conflict of a pagan court. You may not see it at first. If all you're looking at is just one or two moves ahead, it looks like, well, what's this doing here? Just seems like senseless problems. But God is doing something. He is setting the stage. He is preparing for what's to come. At this point, Haman has not even decided to kill the Jews. At this point, Esther has not even imagined being queen. At this point, Mordecai has never even dreamed that he would be on a prime minister in the kingdom of Persia. Before any of that has entered their minds, before the story is even afoot, God is setting the stage. He's preparing events. Like I said, if all you see is just a couple of Persian monarchs squabbling with one another, then you're not seeing the bigger picture, the wider perspective. See, God's ways are inscrutable. There's no way of looking at this event in Esther 1 in real time, and you would walk away thinking, wow, God's really bringing the pieces together here. I mean, if you were standing in the Persian court that day, you would not be thinking, wow, God's doing something. You'd be like, what's going on here? It's just a bunch of selfish people all fighting with each other. That's the problem, is if you look at it in the moment. As you study the book of Esther, all the pieces start to fall in place. And when you get to the end of the story, you can look back and say, oh yeah, God was doing something there in chapter 1. That brings us to a couple of important lessons from chapter 1 of Esther. Number 1, man's sin does not disrupt God's purposes. Isn't that good news? Man's sin does not disrupt God's purposes. Because this whole chapter 1 of Esther is nothing but a bunch of sinful people fighting amongst themselves. But it doesn't disrupt what God's doing. Now, this is a big perennial question that comes up. How do we understand God is sovereign, God's in control, God does what he chooses, and yet there's sin in the world? Well, how do we explain those two? Because, isn't God good? I mean, we wouldn't ascribe to God, we wouldn't say that God's the creator or the original cause of sin. So how do we put the pieces together? Well, there's been several insufficient explanations that have been offered. For instance, number 1, God is not all-powerful. Well, maybe that explains it. There's sin in the world because God can't help it. I mean, he's powerful, but not all-powerful. You say, how could a view like that possibly be articulated even? Well, that's the view that's put forward by Harold Kushner, the Jewish rabbi, in his New York Times bestseller, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Millions of people have read this book. And here's what Kushner says. Well, in the story of the book is that Kushner's son died of a very rare disease. He was only a teenager at the time. And so Kushner wrestled with why would God allow this to happen to his son? And here's what he writes. He states, I could not worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die for whatever exalted reason. In other words, the only way he could hold on to his faith was to assume that, well, God didn't mean for this to happen, it just happened. God couldn't stop it. He was less than all-powerful. Another explanation is that God is not all-knowing. Again, biblically indefensible. But this is the view spread by so-called open theists, who suggest that if God knew the future, then our decisions wouldn't be free decisions. Therefore, God can't know the future. The future doesn't exist until we as human beings make choices. Therefore, God doesn't know the future because it doesn't exist. You say, well, God doesn't know the future? Well, listen to what Gregory Boyd, a proponent of open theism, says. He writes, in one correspondence with my father, He asked me why God would allow Adolf Hitler to be born if he foreknew that this man would massacre millions of people. It was a very good question. The only response I continue to offer now is that this was not foreknown as a certainty at the time God created Hitler. In other words, God doesn't really know. What ends up happening is man is sovereign. Man's decisions determine what's going to happen, and God sort of just follows along and tries to pick up the pieces. Well, this is not what the Bible teaches. The Bible shows that God, though not the author of sin, in the story of his creatures, uses people's sin. Now, we could get into all the details of how God's sovereignty interacts and so on. But get this. People sin, but that doesn't negate God's plan. God uses man's sin even in his plans. For instance, Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph was sinned against. His brothers sold him into slavery. He gets down to Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife lies about him, gets him thrown in prison for years. He gets forgotten about. The whole thing was very unfair. And yet God used it in a way very similar to Esther to preserve his people. Or the best example of all, the one we're going to talk about as we celebrate the Lord's Supper, the cross. The cross was the most sinful expression of man's rebellion against God. They took the only perfect Son of God and nailed him to a cross. There's no more heinous sin I can imagine. And yet God, in his wisdom, made the cross the instrument of saving mankind. So what was the ultimate evil turned into, in God's hand, the ultimate good for humanity. So, man's sin does not disrupt God's purposes. Secondly, the Lord allows, permits, or ordains sin to accomplish his plans. Now, some people will get, the word ordains sin. That seems like, I don't know. You can use the word allows or permits if that's more comfortable. But the point is, God, his story, as the author of our stories, allows sin and sinful choices as part of his plan. Listen to what Chuck Swindoll says about this whole scene. He says, don't fall into the trap of thinking that God is asleep when it comes to nations, or he is out of touch when it comes to carnal banquets, or that he sits in heaven wringing his hands when it comes to godless rulers who make unfair, rash, or even foolish decisions. This is the wonder of God's providence, working behind the scenes, bringing out of even the most carnal and secular of settings a decision that will set his perfect plan in place. I already mentioned the cross. The Lord appointed and foreknew the events that would take place. The sin committed by those leaders nailing Jesus to the cross, but it accomplished something according to God's perfect plan. And let me close on this one. Number 3, God's purposes unfold on his time scale. Let's just think about this together for a moment. God's purposes unfold on his time scale. Have you ever noticed this before? That from the time Vashti is demoted, by the time she is kicked out of the palace, to the time that Esther is crowned queen, there's 4 years that pass between them. It wasn't like he went out the next day and started looking for a new queen. 4 years between Vashti and Esther. Imagine if you were living in year 3. You look back and you say, God, it's been 3 years since that whole mess in the palace. Were you going to do anything about that? And what was the point of all that, God? Why did you disrupt that? Why did that have to happen? Well, just wait another year. When we wonder those questions, God, this happened in my life, and I don't see any purpose for it. I don't know why you brought that along. Why did that person have to die? Why did I have to be diagnosed with that disease? Why did that inconvenience come along? Why did this happen? I wonder if, as we pray that, God would just say, just wait. Just wait. That's what he would say if you were in chapter 3 years out from Vashti. He would say, just wait. The plan is coming together. It's on God's time scale. If you think you can make sense of it 6 months later, it may be 25 years before God's plans start to come around. Just wait. Be patient. See, God's time scale is not our time scale. And the things that he's working out now, we may not see the purpose for many, many years. So don't evaluate, don't make final judgments about what God is doing when you don't have the broad perspective. See, God is the grandmaster. He's moving the pieces on the board. We may not always see why, because we can't see the end of the game. We don't see the checkmate. We only see the pawns moving and being taken. We only see the queen being sacrificed, and we think, what was that about? As we step back and view our lives from God's perspective, we realize he functions his purposes on his time scale. So let me remind us all, I think God, when we wonder about those things, would say, just wait.